Lecture number 14, we're going to talk a little bit more about the key female sex hormones. Okay, the main female sex hormones are the estrogens, and just like we saw with testosterone, in males the estrogens have many different effects on the female body, so they are important for promoting oogenesis and follicle growth. That has to be stimulated by estrogen. So if you don't have these, this is not going to happen. They also trigger anabolic, which refers to growth effects on the female reproductive tract, and that's very similar to what we saw with testosterone in the male. You have a rapid, short-lived growth spurt at puberty in females, and that goes back to the skeletal system. You guys may remember learning about how estrogens stimulate increased mitosis in the growth plates in the long bones, and so that stimulates the female growth spurt. You know how girls typically suddenly shoot up around puberty, and for a while, like 7th or 8th grade, all the guys are ticked off because the girls are taller than them for a brief period of time. But then their growth plates close earlier, if you remember that from the skeletal system, and then the guys, on average, will surpass them in height. Estrogens also lead to the secondary sex characteristics in the female, so the swelling and the growth of the breasts, the development of the mammary glands, the differences in fat deposit in the female versus the male. Females, as everybody knows, typically have a greater amount of fat deposited around the hips and in the breast when compared to a male. And then also you have changes in the pelvis. The pelvic bones, they have to widen and lighten. You have that increased angle in the pubic arch so that you can squeeze a baby through the birth canal during childbirth. And any of these things that we think about as feminine gender characteristics, estrogens are generally going to be involved in those as well, including in the brain. There are psychological impacts on the female brain, just like you have testosterone impacts on the male brain as well. Some metabolic effects of estrogens, and these are not really true secondary sex characteristics, but estrogens are believed to help lower total blood cholesterol. And they also help keep your HDL levels elevated, the good cholesterol levels elevated, like we were talking about at the end of the digestive unit. So remember, HDL is your good cholesterol, so having adequate estrogen is thought to keep those levels high, which could be one of the reasons why, as females age, they're more likely to start developing atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries, after menopause, when the ovaries stop producing estrogen. Also, estrogen is involved in stimulating calcium uptake along the intestinal tract, which is one of the key reasons why women develop osteoporosis problems later in life. They're not able to take up as much calcium from the diet. It's not stored properly in bones. All right, what about progesterone? It's another key hormone. It plays a very important role in regulating the uterine cycle. The uterine cycle follows the same 28-day cycle as the ovarian cycle, but the uterine cycle is referring to the changes along the endometrial lining. Each month it gets thicker, glands develop that produce nourishing fluids for an embryo if it attaches, and you have a nice fresh blood supply that comes in. And if no embryo attaches, the uterus starts contracting and that gets sloughed off. And then the cycle starts over the next month. So that's what's referred to as the uterine cycle. Progesterone also promotes changes in the cervical mucus that we've talked about before. It becomes thicker and plugs the external os of the cervix so that sperm cells can no longer make their way from the vagina into the cervix. So progesterone is made by the corpus luteum early, right after ovulation, and then that continues into early pregnancy if a pregnancy does develop. But by about 3 months into a pregnancy, the placenta completely takes over estrogen production. So it no longer occurs in the corpus luteum. And what is this progesterone needed for? It actually suppresses uterine contractions. Okay, so if you don't have progesterone around, the uterus thinks there's no pregnancy. It's going to start contracting just like it does each month to slough off the uterine lining, and a woman has her menstrual period. But if she's pregnant and progesterone is no longer around to suppress uterine contractions, the pregnancy is going to abort. That's going to lead to a miscarriage. And it's not unusual for females, especially females who are at risk for miscarriages. Maybe they've had a miscarriage in the past. The obstetrician is very likely to check progesterone levels, because low progesterone levels are one of the common causes of miscarriages. Progesterone, this hormone, also acts on the mammary glands, stimulating to get ready for lactation. That's milk production after a baby is born. All right, how about the female sexual response? We talked about the male sexual response back when we were covering that part of the reproductive system. It's initiated by touch, psychological stimuli. The clitoris, the vaginal mucosa, the bulbs of the vestibule, and the breasts all engorge with blood. You have an increased blood flow. The nipples become erect. The clitoris contains spongy tissue in it, just like the corpora cavernosa, corpus spongiosum of the penis in a male. So it engorges with blood and becomes erect as part of the female sexual response. The vestibular glands, which are analogous to the bulbourethral glands in a male, but they're just not as deep inside the body. They secrete lubricating fluid onto the vestibule, the surface on which the opening to the vagina is located. Orgasm in a female is accompanied by muscle tension, rhythmic contractions of the uterus, and increase in pulse rate and blood pressure. And the rhythmic contractions of the uterus, as I mentioned earlier, are there for a type of reverse peristalsis, so that any sperm cells that have been deposited inside the vagina will actually get sucked inward through the cervix into the uterus and propelled onward towards the fallopian tubes. Because if those little sperm cells had to rely, they're pretty good swimmers, but that's a long distance for a sperm cell to swim, all the way from the opening to the cervix, all the way through the vagina, and up through the uterus and into a fallopian tube to find an egg cell to fertilize. All right, lecture number 15. Now that we've covered a few key points about the female sex hormones, lecture number 15, we're going to discuss the hormonal control of the ovarian cycle. So get ready to take some pretty thorough notes on that topic.